Senator from Iowa.
Democrats have shamelessly alleged that a massive federal takeover of elections is needed because of questions some Republicans raised after the 2020 election. So I come to the floor today to show that this whole argument predates the 2020 election. This Democrat reasoning is despite the fact that their proposal predates the 2020 election. The bill that they want us to pass is a product of concerns that the Democrats had about the 2016 election being stolen from Hillary Clinton, also because of the 2018 elections. And in fact, the Democrat proposal was designed specifically to double down on false claims that Democrats lost certain elections in 2018 only because of rigged elections. I've said it before, and I want to say it again. Evidence-free claims of voter suppression are as bad as election-free claims of voter fraud. Both voter fraud and discrimination in voting is illegal. Any claim of voter fraud or violation of voting rights should be resolved in our independent court system with evidence that can stand up in the courts. And as I've mentioned before, the claims by some Trump supporters that certain brand of voting machines switch votes was lifted entirely from the Democrats' 2004 playbook. And you may remember that Democrat House members challenged the electoral vote count of whether George W. Bush was officially and honestly reelected. And President Trump's questioning of his loss in Georgia was simply following in the footsteps of the losing Democrat candidate for governor of that state just 2 years before, who lost a much bigger margin and never admitted that defeat. That makes me wonder if Democrats' professed outrage comes from a sincere concern for democratic reforms, or if they're just upset that President Trump stole their playbook. If Democrats really want to preserve democratic norms, they would not be proposing a federal government overturning the current electoral process in all 50 states on purely partisan basis, with no attempt to even hear out Republicans' legitimate concerns. The bills that we're talking about this week are being called democracy reform. Does democracy need reform? I support the American democratic system. It does not need a fundamental rewrite. 240-year history of our great country under this Constitution ought to support that. It works, and it deserves our support. We should not denigrate American democracy for short-term political gain. President Trump's candidacy in 2016 brought many Americans to the polls who had not voted recently, and there was a record turnout. In 2020, turnout broke the record yet again, both for the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, and President Biden won that election. In the 2021 election, there were unusually high turnouts for off-year elections to the benefit of Republicans and conservatives You saw that, particularly in the state of Virginia, where the Republican candidates statewide were victorious, and you saw some surprising turnouts of opposition to Democrats that were reelected in the state of New Jersey. Democrats accused Republicans of wanting to keep people from voting. Why would we want to keep people from voting when we have been very successful in many large turnout elections very recently? Plus, have you seen the polls today that shows dissatisfaction with Democrats, a Republican deficit of 5 or 7 points last year, with a positive Republican versus Democrat polls this year? So we ought to stop casting doubt about American elections. Stop casting aspersions on common sense election security measures like ID supported by overwhelming numbers of Americans of all backgrounds. And by all backgrounds, I mean even people that we classify as minorities. Let's work together to boost the confidence of all Americans in our elections. Let's start rejecting claims that only way that the other party can win is by rigging elections. Let's retire the short-term strategy of falsely claiming that one of the two parties is a threat to democracy. That in and of itself is a very undemocratic position to take. This kind of rhetoric damages civil society and erodes faith in our democracy. For the sake of our country, please stop it. When Democrats last had the majority and proposed blowing up the Senate rules and the historic way that the Senate has worked, I gave a series of speeches explaining how the father of the Constitution, James Madison, intended for the Senate to be a deliberative body. In other words, a break on the hot passions that occur in the House of Representatives. I repeated my deeply held opposition to gutting the Senate process, even when my party took control of all three branches, and it would have been politically expedient in the short term. I don't know how many times President Trump brought up doing away with what we call the filibuster, or the 60-vote requirement. It was even followed by a lot of our Republican Party grassroots wanting to overcome Democrats' use of the cloture rule to block the Republican agenda during those 4 years. But I spoke out strongly against it in 2017. Over half of the current Democrat senators signed a letter calling for preservation of the current rules requiring a 60 votes to stop debate, for considering the legislation despite the use of nuclear option for nominees. I agree with President Biden's position in 2005, reflecting on the same understanding that I have of the Constitution and the role of the Senate as envisioned by James Madison. Then Senator Biden said this, quote, "That's the reason we have the rule. So when one party controls all levers of government, one man or woman can't stand on the floor of the Senate and resist the passions of the moment," end of quote. Even Senator Schumer, the majority leader, said at that time gutting the cloture rule would be a quote-unquote doomsday for democracy. Doomsday for democracy. Now it seems like Senator Schumer invites that doomsday. Senator Durbin hit the nail on the head as recently as 2018, saying, quote, it would be the end of the Senate as it was originally devised and created, going back to our founding fathers, end of quote. I agreed then, and I agree now. Now the shoe is on the other foot, and Democrats have changed their position. Many, not for the first time. Senator Durbin has now joined the crusade of his Democratic predecessor, Stephen Douglas of Illinois, famous for debating Abraham Lincoln on the issues of slavery. But that Douglas from Illinois also proposed a Senate rule allowing a narrow majority to vote a final vote on bills. Hypocrisy is not rare in politics, on both sides of the aisle. But the fact that Democrats switch principles on such a consequential matter whenever Senate control changes from one party to the other is particularly glaring. The party of Jim Crow, which made liberal use of so-called filibuster just over a year ago to block Republicans' agendas, are now saying falsely it's a relic of Jim Crow. I do not see how they can look the voters in the eyes with no sign of embarrassment. I do not understand why the policemen of our governmental system, the media, isn't roasting them for this hypocritical power grab. I would now like to address a misconception on the cloture motion, the 60-vote requirement. The cloture motion requires 60 votes to bring consideration of legislation to finality. Just because it can be used to block legislation does not mean that the term cloture always equals a filibuster. Cloture cuts off not just debate, but the offering of amendments. Voting for cloture also is saying that the Senate has voted on enough amendments. Senators who have amendments important to their state that they want to offer should be voting against cloture to preserve their right to offer amendments as their constituents might desire. Debate and amendments are the hallmark of this democracy, not an obstacle to be swept aside in pursuit of short-term partisan agenda. When Democrats last controlled the Senate with 60 votes, and thereafter, amendment votes became very rare. Even rank-and-file Democrats lost opportunities to represent their states with amendments important to that state. Let's look at the cloture issue another way. Also, many people confuse debate over filibuster with talking nonstop to delay. That's a kind of Mr. Smith Goes to Washington filibuster, the famous movie, you know. This has nothing to do with cloture. People who talk about returning to the so-called talking filibuster are confusing two different Senate rules, both called filibuster. Senators have never had to talk until they drop from exhaustion to preserve their right to amend bills, so the talking filibuster rhetoric is nonsense. Democrats have convinced themselves, or at least their activist face, and done it falsely, that our democracy is in crisis, and so it is absurd to say only one party unilateral governments can save democracy. But once an exception is made, and they're talking about that exception just for this voting rights bill, but once an exception is made to the right of all senators to debate and to amend legislation, there seems to be no going back. You learned that. Democrats learned that in 2013 when they abolished the 60-vote requirement on district and circuit court judges, and they lived to regret it 4 years later when Republicans did the same thing when we had a Supreme Court justice up. It's a slippery slope that you should not let come about. I yield the floor.